Today's topic is common sense regained by triads. Today I'm going to bring to my aid two American sociologists of about 50 years ago who got their ideas in turn from the European schools, and they say that reality is socially reconstructed. I'm going to piggyback on their idea of reality being socially reconstructed, but I'm going to make a few changes. I would say that reality is culturally reconstituted by our way of thinking. Meaning that if things are good, then our thinking is okay, and if things are lousy, that's because our thinking is flawed. Pretty straightforward. You might ask, well, what kind of times are we living in? Well, it would depend whom you ask, certainly. But if you ask me, I would say that we're living in times of crisis. And how do I understand the crisis? Well, I understand the crisis as that we are in the age of modernity right now. Modernity, there are periodizations in history. And modernity is the one we're living in, preceded by a couple of them. And then we come to Romanticism, and before that, Enlightenment, which is the age of reason. And before that, it's called Renaissance. Renaissance is the break between the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages as they're called, and the Enlightenment, or the modern ages in a way. So these persons, back during the Renaissance period, they rediscovered their ancestors because there had been the Dark Ages of the Middle Ages. And they found out back then, that was the level of scholarship, that the cradle of civilization, or the cradle of the West, was Athens. And Athens back then was understood pretty much Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And principally Plato and Aristotle, because Socrates didn't write anything. And we know of Socrates thanks to Plato, his Socratic dialogues, meaning the dialogues written by Plato about his master or his teacher, who was Socrates. They estimated that the cradle was Plato and Aristotle, basically, as this picture is portrayed. Here we have Plato basically saying, supposedly, because there are interpretations of the painting, saying that we know reality because we have ideas, or his theory of forms. Aristotle, on the other hand, is saying, no, you got it wrong. We know reality because we got five senses. So in a way, both are half right, and in a way, they're both half wrong. So that's the mode of thinking that I call either-or way of thinking. Either this and you're wrong, or this and you're the one who's wrong. Either-or way of thinking. The ones and zeros. Now, the people around them rather, were the pre-Socratics. Back then, there were three schools of thought called the Milesian, founded by Thales of Miletus, the Eleatic, founded by Xenophanes of Colophon, though the principal thinker was Parmenides of Elea, that's where they got their name. And the third school, which wasn't actually a school, it was more like a sect, were the Pythagoreans, founded by Pythagoras. And by sect, I mean they swore secrecy. So there was no real way of knowing what they thought about. We know pretty well from the fragments surviving what were the thoughts of the Milesians and the Eleatics, but we don't really know that much about the Pythagoreans. Fortunately for us, there were two whistleblowers, Ion of Chios and Philolaus of Croton. Ion of Chios said that from his researches, everything was not two or four, but three. That everything was a triad made up of strength, intelligence, and luck. And Philolaus of Croton, he said something similar. He said that everything is made up of unlimiteds, of limiters, and unlimiteds and limiters. To use a vocabulary more customary, or the one we are more used of, is called body, mind, and spirit. By luck would be the spirit part, or the unlimiteds from the Philolaus. The body, or strength, or limiters, and the mind would be intelligence, or limiters and unlimiteds. So basically what they're saying is that things are constituted by triads. Now you would say, well, if that was the case, that everything is triads according to these persons, that everything they in understanding by way of triads, how come they didn't survive? Well, in my research I found, or that's my finding at least, that Aristotle shot it. And by shot it I mean that Aristotle came up with this idea of his, of the 3 laws of thought, which is ironic because it's a triad, you know, and he was the one who shot the triad. In any case, he said that there's the law of identity, which would be correspond to this part. The law of non-contradiction, which would be the body part, and the law of the excluded middle, or the hypotenuse. If you exclude the middle, then you pretty much are shooting the and of the both and. And if the both and has no and, then it's just the either or, which is basically his reaffirmation of his own ideas. So what we have right now is a common sense that is corrupted thanks to these characters, to their either way of thinking. Because if you eliminate the and, that's what you get, zeros and ones. Now there's nothing, no, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with zeros and one. That's the language, but that's the language of machines. That's the language of programming. But we have something called freedom. And freedom means that however much we may be determined, we somehow manage to give it slip and transcend sort of to a second story or second floor, so to speak. So in my humble opinion, the way to regain common sense is simply to unlearn the either or and to learn the both and. This means that the cradle of civilization, or of the West, isn't Athens. Athens comes to represent the systemic philosophers or the systemic thinkers. And the pre-Socratics, the ones surrounding these two thinkers, are the, I don't know how to call them, but they were triadic thinkers. Everybody back then was very much into dynamic way of thinking. And then with the systemic, it became structured as the world that we have right now. And in my opinion, the cornerstone of, like an edifice, a 100-story edifice, if it starts showing cracks at the very top, you don't fix it by going to the, if it's showing cracks at the 100th floor, you don't fix it by going to the 99th or the 98th. You have to go to the very bottom, okay, to the foundations, to the cornerstone. And the cornerstone is flawed because of this either way of thinking. It's more of a dualism, as I said, it's of ones and zeros. So the way to go is to actually reconstitute our social edifice by putting in place as cornerstone the triad way of thinking. And this triad in turn is based on bedrock. But that's another story that we'll talk about in another occasion. So then, going back to the original question of what kind of civilization are we living in, is it good or bad? And we said that if it's doing bad, then our thinking is flawed, and if it's doing good, then our thinking is sound. And we said that we're living in a crisis, which means that we're kind of more bad than good. And the way to fix this crisis is by regaining our common sense. And we regain our common sense by unlearning the either or of the systemic philosophers of either this or that, and learning the both and of Socrates. Now Socrates, we don't know anything about him because all we know is what we know from him, from Plato. But if we sandwich Socrates, which we may not know about him, but we know who came before, which were the pre-Socratics, and who came after, which are Plato and Aristotle, we can get a better idea. So I'm of the opinion that whoever painted this one, Jacques David, back in 1789, thereabouts, this kind of painting is called neoclassic, which is very symbolic. You know, where symbolic means that it has certain symbols that have meaning, and it's not just a figure. You know, it has meaning, and the meaning that he's trying to communicate to us is the idea of the triads. That the backstory of Socrates isn't the Platonic dialogues; it's more the Socratic thinkers. So Socrates is more about Socratic thinkers, or the pre-Socratic thinkers rather. Socrates is more about the pre-Socratic thinkers and less about Plato and Aristotle. And the common sense that we're proposing, that we think that we can regain so as to reconstitute our broken world and make it whole again, would be a common sense by triads. So, in a nutshell, if we want to continue our broken world, well, we need to revise or upgrade our business as usual model, okay? Come up with a new, the 21st century model of the business as usual. But if we really want to get past and reconstitute our world for once and for all, then we have to go to the cornerstone of culture and regain our common sense. Because common sense is all we need, guys. All we need to reconstitute our world from the broken mess that it is onto wholeness. That's all we need, common sense. Nothing. Right now we're between a hard place, a rock and a hard place, between a world of information, a wealth of information, an ocean of information on the one hand, and on the other hand having to rely on authority because we cannot make sense of so much thing out there. Okay, there are too many trees and very little forest. So we need to regain our common sense, and once we regain our common sense by thinking with triads, something like this, then we'll be well on our way of fixing. Now, as I said, triads is very general and it applies to everything. According to Ion of Chios, the virtue of everything is a triad. So we're body, mind, and spirit. Our way of thinking should be a triad because we are triads. Family is a triad. Mom, dad, and child, okay? Dad, mom, child, okay? The city is a triad as well. How is that? Well, neighborhoods, people, and education. So as you can see, everything's a triad. And we can reconstitute our broken city as well if we start looking at it as part of a triad. Thank you very much and have a beautiful day.